The world stopped on July 27, 2012 to witness the opening ceremony of the 27th Olympic Games in London, following by far the largest, most expensive, and most extravagant opening ceremony of all time in Beijing 4 years earlier. There had been one or two concerns in the build-up to the London Olympics that Britain's follow-up would pale in comparison. They needn't have worried. Whilst there weren't as many dancers, nowhere near as many fireworks, and a distinct lack of militarism by comparison, London's opening ceremony still drew rave reviews. Over 4,000 actors and volunteers took to the stage, playing out significant events from British history with a particular focus on the Industrial Revolution, the creation of the National Health Service, and Britain's cultural output within the fields of music, television, literature and film. It lasted 4 hours, and it was watched by nearly 1 in 7 people on the planet. At the centre of it all, the jewel in the crown of the £6.5 billion Olympic Park in Stratford, was the Olympic Stadium, an 80,000 capacity mega stadium, the 5th largest in Europe, which wouldn't have an empty seat in sight for the next 2 weeks. After the London Olympics drew to a close and all eyes turned to Rio, West Ham United won a bid to become the stadium's new tenants, and the Olympic Stadium underwent a more than £300 million conversion in order to host Premier League football. The Hammers moved in at the start of the 2016-17 season, leaving Upton Park behind, their home for more than 100 years. West Ham are massive everywhere they go, or so their supporters claim, and now they have an equally massive stadium. Expanded ahead of the start of the 2022-23 season to a capacity of 62,500, West Ham now have the second highest average attendance in the Premier League, trailing only Manchester United, and the 9th highest in the entirety of world football, above Arsenal, Liverpool, PSG and Juventus. This is a club that was playing in the Championship the season before the Olympic Stadium first opened, and whose former stadium, Upton Park, only held 35,000 fans, nearly half of what West Ham hope the London Stadium will hold, after its next expansion. On the face of it, it seems like a win-win-win. There is just one small problem. Everyone hates it. And I do mean pretty much everyone. West Ham fans hate it, opposition fans hate it, and British and London taxpayers really hate it. During yet another home defeat for West Ham against Brentford earlier last week, Brentford fans mocked the home supporters by chanting, "You sold your soul for this shithole." They're not the first club to taunt West Ham fans over the London Stadium, nor will they be the last. Tottenham fans sang the same chant all the way back in 2017, but at that time, the issues relating to the London Stadium were supposed to be teething problems, which would soon be resolved. 8 years on, very little has changed. West Ham, who finished 7th in their last season at Upton Park, are currently 16th in the Premier League table, and the London Stadium remains a major bone of contention in ongoing complaints the supporters have regarding how the club is run. So in today's video, we're going to take a look at why the London Stadium is so divisive, why it was so dreadfully ill-conceived, and, as West Ham approach a decade playing there, whether the many problems with it can ever actually be resolved. So sit back, relax, and join me on a journey to Stratford, as we take a look at why almost everyone seems to hate the London Stadium. We will get deeper into the details and nuances later on, I promise you, but one of the primary reasons why people dislike the London Stadium is because, whether you call it the London Stadium or the Olympic Stadium, it is still an Olympic stadium in the sense that it was built to host the Olympics and not football matches. That might not seem like a fundamental difference. Heck, if you're Italian, you might be wondering what the difference there is at all. But athletic stadiums and football stadiums should be completely different beasts. It's not just the totally different configuration of the track, pitch or field, it is the sightlines from the stands, which are designed to provide very different views of two very different sports, disciplines and events. The view, therefore, from a lot of seats in the London Stadium, a venue built for an athletics competition, cannot be compared to the view from every seat in the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium, a similarly sized but purpose-built football stadium. Then there is the minor issue of the great big running track which surrounds the pitch, putting a lot of distance between the fans and the action. This has several negative consequences in football. Firstly, the view is worse. Obviously, because everyone, from those pitch side to those up in the gods, are much further away from the pitch than they would be if there wasn't, a great big running track between it and them. Secondly, the atmosphere is badly impacted because a lot of noise is lost in the vast expanse of space between the stands, meaning that two chants are sometimes sung simultaneously at the London Stadium, as one end of the ground drowns out the other one, resulting in a confused and strange mesh and mess of a noise. A bit like when Lawrence Fox tried to launch a career in music.
They have put something in the water, they seek a cure for the conversation.
And thirdly, there is an emotional detachment which is created by the physical separation from the game, which was particularly acute at West Ham as a result of the juxtaposition between Upton Park and the London Stadium. Opened in 1904, without wanting to go full boomer on all of you, Upton Park was what you might term a proper old-school English stadium, which was tight, intimate, and the stands, though considerably smaller than those at the London Stadium, towered over the pitch. That gave the impression of supporters being active participants in the action. In fact, that's an understatement. It didn't give the impression of that. That was actually the case. Speak to West Ham players and managers prior to their move to the London Stadium in 2016, and they'll tell you how often the fans had a massive impact upon the game, both positively for them and negatively for the opposition. To understand why the London Stadium wasn't built as a football stadium, which could double up as an athletic stadium for the Olympics, so as to give it a long-term purpose, or even to be easily adapted and converted into a football stadium, or even to be not very easily and at an enormous cost adapted into a football stadium, we must go back to the start. So, basically, scientists believe that the universe began as a singular, infinitely hot dense point that expanded rapidly around 13.8 billion years ago, giving rise to space, time and matter in an event known as the Big Bang. Alright. Not that far back, just to 2005, when Britain, or the UK, won the bid to host the 2012 Summer Olympic Games. It was 2 decades ago now, so you could be forgiven for having forgotten, or for some of you not even having been born yet, but the bidding process for the 2012 Olympics was a pretty feisty one. The French bid, for Paris to host, was considered the frontrunner. Paris had the highest suitability ranking according to the IOC working group, scoring an average of 8.5 out of 10 across 11 different criteria, including accommodation and sports venues, but also things like environmental impact and project legacy. Madrid ranked second with a score of 8.3, London third with a score of 7.6, and New York fourth with a score of 7.5, followed by the host bids of Moscow, Leipzig, Rio, Istanbul, and Havana. As well as having the highest score, France hadn't hosted a Summer Olympics since 1924, whereas Spain had hosted as recently as 1992, albeit in Barcelona rather than Madrid. Britain and London had last hosted in 1948, where my great-granddad was a judge in the swimming. True story. And the USA had hosted in both 1984 and 1996 in Los Angeles and Atlanta. Everything pointed towards Paris, but the Labour government, elected in 1997, at the same time that the British Olympic Association began preparing their bid, were desperate to bring the Games to London. New Labour, led by Prime Minister Tony Blair, who won a landslide election in 1997 following 18 years of Conservative rule, were fixated with the idea of global Britain. Hosting the Olympics fit in with New Labour's domestic priorities of projecting a sort of modern nationalism and national pride, a kind of make the Union flag cool again campaign, in addition to their foreign or overseas priorities, namely, attempting to showcase Britain as still being a powerful and influential force on the international stage. You can either agree or disagree with the project itself, but as a means of executing it, hosting the Olympics was at least preferable to becoming America's lapdog in 2 wars in the Middle East. There were all of the other usual motivations too, like regenerating the area around the Olympic Village, improving transport links, and getting more people involved in sport. But that is the case with almost all host bids. And so, the UK and Blair began making their case, shall we just say, quite forcefully, much to the distaste of the Paris and the other rival bids. Blair first drew heat for promoting London's bid in Nigeria in 2003, something which the IOC expressly forbids before the final candidates have been selected. Former Olympic gold medalist Sebastian Coe was appointed as the head of the London 2012 bid in a successful attempt to court favour with IOC members, and Blair went on the charm offensive right up to the final vote in Singapore, lobbying IOC members on the strength of London's bid. The most controversial offer made by the London bid was perhaps its incentives for athletes competing at the Games, which included free flights, food and vouchers for long-distance phone calls. Those promises were quickly withdrawn, likely due to fears that they broke IOC rules, with the French becoming increasingly exasperated with what they viewed as Britain's underhand tactics at the time. London 2012 didn't just talk up the London bid, but also talk down Paris. French delegates considered submitting a formal complaint after London bid consultants Jim Sloman and Rod Sheard claimed that the Stade de France, which would be the primary venue of the Paris Games, wasn't suitable for athletics, when IOC rules prohibit host bids from making any comments about rival bids. The whole thing turned pretty nasty, but there was perhaps no argument that the London bid made themselves that did their prospects more good than the French president Jacques Chirac's gaffe after his anger at the London bid's behaviour spilt over. The day before the IOC voted on their respective bids, Chirac commented that, quote, "The only food worse than British food is Finnish," before adding, quote, "The only thing the British have done for Europe's agriculture is mad cow disease," end quote. Mocking English cuisine is a time-honoured French tradition, like carrying baguettes around town and not washing, but in the context of the IOC, it was considered unsportsmanlike and rude, undermining any moral authority or superiority that the French might have had over the underhand tactics of the British up to that point. What made it much, much worse, however, was the fact that Chirac brought the Finnish into things for seemingly no good reason when there were two IOC members from Finland who would vote the following day to determine which bid would be successful. Since the margin of victory between the London and Paris bids was so narrow, Chirac's last-minute gaffe may have been a costly one. Bertrand Delanoë, the mayor of Paris at the time, said after the London bid won by 54 votes to 50, quote, "They have not respected the rules established by the International Olympic Committee. I do not say that they were flirting with the yellow line, I say that they crossed the yellow line." End quote. The pressure on London to deliver a world-class Olympics was intense then, not only because of the controversial bidding process, but also due to previous issues relating to Britain's ability to build major infrastructure projects and host major sporting events. Wembley Stadium, for example, though it was considered a world-class stadium once it opened, and is still considered to be one of the best in the world now, was delayed by 4 whole years, finally opening in 2007, rather than 2003, as was initially proposed, by which stage costs had spiralled from an initial budget of £326.5 million to more than double that amount, £789 million, when the project was finally completed. Even more humiliating was the World Championships in Athletics, which London had won the right to host in 2005. When the government deemed the cost of building a new stadium in Pickett's Lock to be too expensive, UK Athletics suggested hosting the World Championships in Sheffield instead, but that proposal was rejected by the IAAF on the basis that London, serving as the host city, had been integral to the UK's successful bid. As a result, the UK was stripped of hosting rights, the bidding process was reopened, and Finland's bid to host the Games in Helsinki won out instead. Which must have been a real nightmare for the French. As soon as London won the 2012 Olympic bid, therefore, they wanted to get to work on the Olympic Stadium. The initial proposal put to Tony Blair in 2003 by the architect and member of the House of Lords Richard Rogers, known as the Water City Scheme, was to construct a new mega stadium in Stratford as part of a regeneration plan for East London, which would be funded by a joint tenancy agreement between Tottenham Hotspur and West Ham United, and would be converted easily to serve as both clubs' permanent homes after the Olympics. The proposal was complicated over land and funding issues, in addition to Sebastian Coe's promise to the IOC that the Olympic Stadium would retain a permanent running track as part of London's post-Olympic legacy plan in 2005, which some considered to be integral to the success of the London bid. When that fell apart, separate talks were held with individual clubs about moving into the stadium, including West Ham, but none were conclusive. It is also worth noting that West Ham were relegated from the Premier League in 2003, failed to win promotion from the First Division, soon to be renamed the Championship in 2004, and their chairman and majority shareholder Terry Brown faced significant criticism at the time owing to the club's relegation, the sale of their star players, and perceived financial mismanagement. Things would go from bad to worse under Icelandic businessmen Egert Magnusson and Björgulfur Gudmundsson, who bought the club in 2006, but at the start of the Olympic Stadium negotiations, West Ham were a second-tier club without an overly wealthy or ambitious owner, who were struggling to sell out the 35,000 capacity Upton Park. It's not exactly surprising, then, that they were a little non-committal when it came to taking on a post-Olympics megastadium. The London Olympic Board, with Wembley and the 2005 World Championships in athletics foremost in their mind, felt that they couldn't afford to wait around though, so at a fateful meeting in February 2007, it was determined that construction should begin on the new Olympic Stadium in Stratford, with no plans to ever convert the new venue into a football stadium, but to instead reduce its capacity from 80,000 to 25,000, removing 55,000 temporary seats after the month-long Olympics and Paralympics had come to an end, but retaining it as the UK's permanent primary athletic stadium. These were a pretty half-baked set of proposals, but it maintained the London bid's promise to retain an athletics track and, most importantly, it allowed them to press ahead with construction and remain on schedule. In 2008, however, so just a year later, London's Labour Mayor Ken Livingstone was defeated at the ballot box by future Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who was obsessed with major infrastructure projects and both their and his own personal legacy. As far as Johnson was concerned, a 25,000 capacity athletics stadium was neither big nor impressive enough to maintain the momentum of regenerating Stratford and East London, so he reopened talks with football clubs. Encouraged by Johnson to provide West Ham with some competition, Spurs also put forward a proposal, but as the Olympic Stadium hadn't been built with any capability to be converted into a football stadium, Spurs proposed knocking the entire thing down and building a purpose-built football stadium in its place, throwing in a promise to redevelop London's athletics venue in Crystal Palace as an alternative to maintaining a permanent athletics stadium in Stratford. They somewhat ambitiously estimated that the entire project would cost £250 million. Tottenham's proposal ticked a few of Johnson's boxes, but the idea of tearing down a more than £500 million stadium, after it had been in operation for barely a few weeks, was an unsurprisingly controversial one, and it prompted a furious response from the London Organising Committee for the Olympic Games chairman Sebastian Coe, who described it as a betrayal. It also violated the promise that Coe had personally made to the IOC during the controversial bidding process. There was even a third, oft-forgotten bid to become the Olympic Stadium's new occupants, launched by Leyton Orient. The closest professional club geographically to the new stadium, Orient proposed sharing the Olympic Stadium with West Ham, with sports promoter and then owner Barry Hearn offering to rename the club London Orient as part of the club's proposals. But despite being selected as the preferred anchor tenant by the London Legacy Development Corporation, the fact that Orient were in League One, had an average attendance of less than 5,000 at the time, and no money, ultimately scuppered their bid. Both Spurs and Leyton Orient challenged West Ham's bid in the courts though, which delayed West Ham's move and the start of the major work required to convert the stadium. The initial cost of the conversion was estimated at £160 million, but following poor weather, whoever would have anticipated that in London, delays and complications relating to the 21,000 retractable seats that West Ham promised would bring fans closer to the action, that bill spiralled to £323 million. So, a little over double the initial budget. Thankfully for West Ham, they only paid an initial £15 million towards the cost of converting the stadium, 1-5, not 5-0, equivalent to less than 5% of the overall conversion cost and less than 2% of the £752 million that the stadium cost as a whole. Whilst Tottenham's proposal to demolish the Olympic Stadium and build a new one on the same site was considered unconscionable, the vast cost reflects the fact that, in essence, that is basically what happened. The Olympic Stadium had to be almost entirely rebuilt, just from the inside out, rather than from the outside in. So who paid for it? In short, the British public. Central government coughed up over £200 million towards the transformation, in the form of 3 separate payments from 3 separate departments. Newham Council provided a £40 million loan in exchange for a 35% stake in the stadium, and the rest came courtesy of a £1 million contribution from UK Athletics and £3.5 million from the London Marathon Charitable Trust. The terms of West Ham's tenancy were immediately controversial, and nothing has changed almost a decade on. Described as the deal of the century by many industry experts, in addition to their £15 million upfront contribution to the conversion cost, West Ham signed a 99-year lease with an annual rent, which is pegged to inflation, of £2.5 million, plus some very minor additional payments if West Ham was successful on the pitch, based upon things like league finishes and qualifying for Europe, and a rent reduction in the event of relegation. Additionally, the LLDC, the London Legacy Development Corporation, a publicly funded body which is owned and operated by the Greater London Authority, agreed to take on all of the stadium's operating costs indefinitely, despite West Ham keeping all of the stadium's revenue from ticket sales. Even the stadium's naming rights, despite the stadium being owned and fully operated by the LLDC, any amount above £4 million would be split 50-50 between the LLDC and West Ham, in addition to a 70-30 split on any catering revenue above £500,000. Put mildly then, the London Stadium has been a disaster as far as the public purse is concerned. Not only did it cost over £1 billion, factoring in inflation, to build and convert into its current state, it has made a net loss of at least £30 million over the last 2 years alone, almost a decade into the arrangement, and there is little reason to believe that the economic outlook, as far as the LLDC is concerned, will improve anytime soon. One way of raising slightly more revenue, albeit shared with West Ham, would be to agree a naming rights deal for the stadium, but almost 9 years since the Hammers moved in, the stadium still hasn't had a single sponsorship deal. Talks were held between the LLDC and the prolific stadium sponsors Allianz a little over a year ago, but in the end, the German insurance firm opted to sponsor Twickenham Stadium, the home of England rugby instead. Even if a deal can be struck, and, again, there is no good reason to believe that anything is imminent, the LLDC would still be hemorrhaging cash on the ground. The whole thing is, at best, a shambles, and there have been accusations of something even more sinister being afoot. Karen Brady, who is the vice chairman of West Ham and is reported to have received a sizable bonus for her role in West Ham's move to the London Stadium, and then Mayor of London and future Prime Minister Boris Johnson, are reported to have a close personal relationship. In 2013, during Olympic Stadium negotiations, Brady addressed the Conservative Party conference in Manchester and gave a speech in which she encouraged the audience to support David Cameron and George Osborne's disastrous austerity policies. The following day, Brady was appointed by the Conservative government as a small business ambassador, and less than a year later, while Olympic Stadium negotiations were still ongoing, she was nominated for a Conservative life peerage in Prime Minister David Cameron's New Year's honours list, becoming Baroness Brady of Knightsbridge in the city of Westminster. Sebastian Coe, incidentally, the chairman of the Olympic Organising Committee, who approved there being no contingency plan for the Olympic Stadium to ever become a football stadium, and who later backed West Ham's bid to move into the Olympic Stadium, was also a member of the House of Lords at the time, having accepted a life peerage in 2000, having served as a Conservative Party MP from 1992 until 1997. When Boris Johnson stepped down as the Mayor of London after 2 terms, Coe was reported to be the Conservative Party's preferred candidate to replace him. When he decided not to run, several party apparatchiks suggested that Karen Brady run in opposition to Sadiq Khan as Johnson's successor instead. What's the saying? It's all one big club, and you're not in it. Neither Coe nor Brady actually stood, so the responsibility fell on billionaire heir and man of the people Zach Goldsmith, who lost the election and now spends his time getting ratioed by football YouTubers on social media. How the mighty fall, eh? In addition to the cosy relationship between key figures at West Ham and in the Conservative Party, who came to power in London in 2008 and nationally in coalition with the Liberal Democrats in 2010, there have also been direct endorsements and donations. West Ham, as in the actual football club, not specific directors or associated companies, donated £12,500 to the Conservative Party directly in January 2016. Less than a month later, Karen Brady and West Ham's late co-owner David Gold attended the annual Black and White Ball, which has nothing to do with Newcastle United or Grimsby Town, but is in fact the Conservative Party's largest annual fundraising event. In 2019, Gold's co-owner at West Ham and fellow former pornographer David Sullivan, the two of whom were once nicknamed the Dildo Brothers by Sporting president Bruno de Carvalho, personally donated a further £75,000 to the Conservative Party, then led by former London Mayor Boris Johnson during the 2019 general election campaign. And finally, because we couldn't just end there, in 2022, West Ham used club money once again, because what else would a football club spend a bit of spare cash on, to donate a further £9,000 to the Conservative Party during Liz Truss's short-lived stint as Prime Minister and party leader. I feel like I'm talking about Liz Truss's short stint there in the same way that you might describe a manager who came in to try and turn around a relegation-threatened club, but was sacked after just a few games. Which is, incidentally, quite a good analogy. It should be said, whenever question marks surrounding close relationships, political donations, or peerages have been raised, everyone involved, as you would expect, has denied any wrongdoing. Boris Johnson has gone on the record as saying that he has nothing to hide, but then again, he also claimed that taxpayers would pay, and I quote, no more money towards the Olympic Stadium after striking a car crash deal with West Ham in 2015, and almost a decade on, the taxpayer is still footing a bill worth an annual £20 million plus. But hey, that's just a rounding error, isn't it? I mean, what is £20 million a year in taxpayer cash between friends? Stop being such a Puritan. Some critics have described West Ham's 99-year lease as being so favourable to them that Johnson would have to be either an idiot or have had malevolent intentions in order to agree to it, but, and I really cannot stress this enough, I don't think that we can rule out both of the above. For legal reasons, I should clarify, I am only detailing what are a series of facts that have been reported in regard to relationships, payments, and political appointees. I am not saying that there was any funny business going on whatsoever, and I'm not just saying that because I have to. The LLDC was operating with their hands tied behind their backs after the Olympics had drawn to a close, desperately in search of a permanent occupant for the Olympic Stadium, with only a couple of viable suitors and two incredibly contentious sets of proposals. The serious strategic errors with long-term ramifications were all made much earlier on, and while the deal appeared to be especially egregious, even given the circumstances, there were no good options at that stage. So that is why taxpayers hate it, but what have West Ham fans got to complain about? They got a massive stadium for peanuts, massively increased their attendances and matchday revenue as a result, and they were able to grow as a club. Sure, you can land an aircraft between the pitch and the stands, and there is a better view of the action from a big slide in the Olympic Park than there is from some of the seats, but who cares about that? Well, quite a lot of people, as it transpires, but it goes deeper than that. Upton Park, or the Bowling Ground, was West Ham's spiritual home. It had its problems, of course, by which I mean it was basically falling apart, the toilets were quite frankly a disgrace, and it was easier to get a pint in the centre of Riyadh than it was on the concourse there at half-time, but most West Ham fans had a visceral connection to the ground. It was about more than 4 stands and a plastic seat. It was the childhood memories of their dads and granddads taking them to their first game. It was the walk along Green Street to get to the ground, the smell of frying burgers from countless vans which lined the road, the friendly and familiar faces of day traders and programme sellers, the myriad of pubs which engulfed the ground, many of them older than Upton Park itself, and the pie and mash venues that had reliably been serving up the iconic dishes of the East End for over 100 years. It might sound sentimental, and that is because it is, but as with the experience inside of the ground and the contrasting architecture of the stadiums themselves, it was the jarring contrast between the authenticity, history and tradition of Upton Park and the sanitised, modern and manufactured feel of everything that surrounded the matchday experience at the London Stadium that they found so alienating. The walk from Stratford Station and through the giant glass Westfield shopping centre, past a TK Maxx, the Olympic Aquatics Centre, and the massive red slide thing that I mentioned a moment ago, couldn't feel any more juxtaposed to the West Ham of old. And as if all of that wasn't bad enough, it is still a nightmare trying to get a pie or a pint at half-time. The West Ham hierarchy also made next to no effort to try and create a more seamless transition to the new ground. The East End street traders were given no correspondence and no invitation or permission to follow the club, stripping them of an income source and supporters of a sense of familiarity and goodwill following the move. Nathan's Pies and Eels, one of the most iconic pie and mash shops outside of Upton Park, shut down permanently in 2018. Even among West Ham fans who were receptive to the stadium move and may have viewed it as a necessary evil in order to grow and progress the club, this seeming disdain for what they had considered to be valid concerns bred resentment, which boiled over in 2018 when fans invaded the pitch and caused the game to be halted as co-owners Sullivan and Gold had to be escorted from their seats after fans set up on the director's box and launched missiles towards them. Whilst Mark Noble wrestled some pitch invaders to the ground, and the off-field distraction was obviously criticised by everyone employed by the club, secretly, managers and players had significant complaints of their own. Slaven Bilic, the West Ham manager at the time, has since talked about the difficulty of the transition. Bilic described how opponents hated coming to Upton Park, where the pitch was tight, supporters were right on top of them, and the turf could get a little boggy and unreliable during the winter months, but the London Stadium by contrast was inviting, the atmosphere put more pressure on the home team than the away side, and how, according to him, his players were distracted by the vast expanse of green that surrounded the pitch, covering the running track, which could be disorientating and did not clearly delineate in an instant where one ended and the other one began. West Ham requested permission to cover the track in a claret carpet, both to improve the visuals for their players, but also to give the stadium a more personalised feel for their supporters, but the LLDC declined, saying that they had to maintain colours with a 2012 Olympic legacy vibe, meaning that they would only stretch as far as navy. They reversed that decision following persistent lobbying by West Ham in 2019, after the Hammers had been in the stadium for 3 years, but it illustrated how, much as West Ham may have commercially secured a remarkable deal for themselves, there would be issues, beyond the architecture of it being an athletic stadium, related to not actually owning their own ground. Another incident cropped up when the Hammers had to unveil the signing of Pablo Zabaleta at the London Eye, almost an hour away, because they didn't have access to the London Stadium at the time, and when West Ham employees were told that they couldn't use the stadium's car park for a period of time, and would have to access their offices via a shuttle bus service instead. These might seem like minor inconveniences, but when there are enough of them, they begin to add up. The fact that West Ham can't profit from the multi-use purposes and functionality of their stadium, because it isn't actually their stadium, and don't get to retain all of the stadium's matchday revenue when it comes to things like catering, does have an impact upon their bottom line. West Ham's matchday and overall revenue has risen significantly since moving from Upton Park to the London Stadium, but not quite as significantly as some people might imagine, given the increase in their capacity and attendances. Between the 2015-16 and 2016-17 seasons, for example, the season before and the season after West Ham's stadium move, their matchday revenue only rose by £2 million from £27 to £29 million. There has been more significant progress post-COVID, with West Ham having raised over £40 million in matchday revenue in each of the last 3 seasons, nearly doubling their income on a matchday from the 3 seasons before leaving Upton Park. With that having been said, despite having the second highest attendances in the Premier League on average, the Hammers only ranked 7th in the league in terms of matchday revenue, lagging some way behind the top 6. Though Tottenham's average attendances are lower than West Ham's, their matchday revenue is over 2.5 times larger than the Hammers, at just shy of £120 million, and expected to rise further still in their next set of accounts. West Ham's matchday revenue, therefore, is caught in a bit of a no-man's land in a Premier League context alongside Newcastle's, where it is much higher than the likes of Brighton and Aston Villa's, but frankly nowhere near even the lowest figure among the rich 6, namely at Chelsea and Man City, who are tied on £76 million in matchday revenue, almost 70% higher than West Ham's. In fact, even if you look solely since West Ham moved from Upton Park and into the London Stadium, Manchester City's matchday revenue growth has still outpaced West Ham's. That is not to dismiss the significance of West Ham's increase in revenue since moving stadiums. It is still the equivalent of signing a new £20 million player every season. It is just to contextualise it, along with the less tangible benefits, in terms of perception and prestige. The Manchester City comparison is an interesting one. The Etihad Stadium, formerly the City of Manchester Stadium, was also built to host an athletics competition, initially as part of Manchester's bids to host the 1996 and the 2000 Summer Olympics, both of them unsuccessful, but was later adapted as the host venue for the 2002 Commonwealth Games. The plan for the City of Manchester Stadium was always for it to be converted into a football stadium after the games, and Manchester Council even tried at one stage to gain further funding for it to become England's new national stadium, replacing the old Wembley, before the decision to redevelop and rebuild a new Wembley on the same site was formalised. Athletics figures, including Sebastian Coe, lambasted the decision to convert the City of Manchester Stadium into a football stadium after the Commonwealth Games, but Sport England felt that football was the only sustainable long-term use for a stadium that size, and that leaving it as an athletics stadium would run the risk of it turning into a white elephant. The City of Manchester Stadium, therefore, was able to be converted into a football stadium for a cost of just £42 million, nearly half of which was provided by Manchester City. There are, of course, still Man City fans who mourn Main Road, but the Etihad doesn't feel like an athletic stadium. It feels like a football stadium, and despite being owned by the council like the London Stadium, for Man City fans, it quickly felt like home. There are other factors at play here, like the success of Man City since moving to the stadium and the amount of money that the Emiratis have ploughed into the surrounding area, that have bred a greater sense of affinity, but in terms of the pure planning, foresight, cost and convenience, the Etihad is like the anti-London Stadium. It's not just the Etihad though. While most West Ham fans understand that Upton Park was difficult to redevelop or expand, and therefore probably had to be left behind if the club was to grow their revenue, Spurs stand as a neighbourly example of just what could have been. Having stuck to their guns when it came to knocking down the Olympic Stadium and building their own stadium in its place, after that was rejected, Tottenham turned their attention to knocking down White Hart Lane and building a new stadium there instead. As a result, Spurs now have a world-class stadium, which is genuinely one of the best in the world, without having to leave behind what has been their home and postcode for the last 125 years. Sure, it was much more expensive. Spurs paid about £1 billion compared to West Ham's £15 million plus a few million a year in rent, but Tottenham fans got a stadium that they could be proud of, which instantly felt like home, and which is far, far more lucrative. Within less than 10 years, Spurs will have made up the entire cost of their new stadium through matchday revenue and hosting other major sporting events and concerts. Meanwhile, West Ham employees may still have to get on a shuttle bus to work because they have been banned from using their own car park because it isn't really their car park. Arsenal, of course, provide another nearby example. Meanwhile, envious eyes must be being cast from East London towards Merseyside at this moment in time, as Everton are not only enjoying fine form since appointing former West Ham boss David Moyes, they are also about to move into a purpose-built £750 million 52,888 capacity super stadium, which is everything that the London Stadium is not. The architecture of the Everton Stadium, built at Bramley-Moore Dock, is centred around the matchday experience. So the stands are steep, by modern standards, locking in sound and creating intimacy despite the stadium's size. The views of the pitch, even from the top row of every stand, are flawless, and there are little details all around the stadium that are a nod to Everton's past. Goodison Park is every bit, if not even more storied, as beloved and as steeped in tradition as Upton Park, but the way in which Everton's stadium move has been managed is chalk and cheese when compared to West Ham's, and at a club that has got an awful lot wrong in recent years, serves as an example of how to get at least one thing very right. In many ways, the City of Manchester Stadium, in its seamless transition and long-term viability, is the exception though, and the London Stadium is much closer to the rule. Of the brand new stadiums built specifically for the Summer Olympics, the Beijing National Stadium, popularly known as the Bird's Nest, hasn't had a permanent tenant since 2010 and only remains profitable because the Chinese charge tourists and visitors 50 yen to visit it. Although, by 2013, some of those same tourists and visitors were already complaining about the state that the stadium was falling into. The Sydney Olympic Stadium, now known as Stadium Australia, is broadly hated by Australians, despite its name, suffers from a lot of the same problems as the London Stadium, and is considered a poor venue for almost all sports, concerts and events, despite two separate $80 million renovation and adaptation projects. Atlanta's Olympic Stadium was rebuilt immediately after the Olympics as a baseball stadium for the Atlanta Braves, and has since been rebuilt once again as an American football stadium for Georgia State University after the Braves moved out. The Seoul Olympic Stadium, despite being the largest stadium in South Korea, hosts the occasional concert here and there, but has long been a white elephant of epic proportions, or a money-drinking hippo, which is the expression in Korean. Montreal's Olympic Stadium was converted into a baseball stadium, but no baseball has been played there since 2004. It is now almost permanently unused and a massive drag on the public purse, as is the Olympiastadion in Munich, which hasn't had a proper use since Bayern Munich moved to the Allianz Arena in 2005. The success stories, then, are few and far between. Another problem at West Ham, as far as West Ham fans see it, is the gulf between what they were promised and what has been delivered, which is arguably as large as the gulf between the seats of the London Stadium and the pitch. A world-class team in a world-class stadium was the promise, but what West Ham fans are currently witnessing seems quite a long way from world-class. Mediocre class might even be a stretch. The gap between themselves and Wolves means that, even in a calamitous season, the Hammers should still survive, but survival wasn't the promise when they waved farewell to Upton Park. It's also an awkward fact that, of West Ham's three highest league finishes over the last decade, one was their final season at Upton Park, and another one was the 2020-21 COVID season, when no fans were allowed inside of any stadiums. For now, for all of the complaints, West Ham's owners will consider the stadium move to have been a roaring success. Karen Brady, whose highlights at West Ham include plugging her new television show at the same time as West Ham faced Stoke City, and tweeting an image of a cheese board and a selection of desserts which was captioned, "Arsenal's desserts," while West Ham were losing 3-0 away at Arsenal, responded to criticism from supporters in 2016 by stating at a sports business conference, quote, "We are in the Olympic Stadium, we have limited outside debt, and we are ranked 15th in terms of brand values. We were 115th when I joined the club. We're now 20th in the Deloitte Money League." End quote. We're 15th in terms of brand values and 20th in the Deloitte Money League, for Christ's sake. Why aren't you cheering me? What more do you want? We know what we are. We know what we are. 15th in terms of brand values and 20th in the Deloitte Money League. We know what we are. In the same speech, Brady commented that West Ham had no culture when Sullivan and Gold arrived. I mean, talk about keep on digging. There is a serious point to be made here, though. West Ham made a trade-off between tradition, emotion, and, to some extent, the matchday experience in the pursuit of economic growth and development. It is a decision that almost every owner in English football would have made on the terms that West Ham were offered, and it means that the club is worth about 9 times more than it was when Gold and Sullivan bought it in 2010, and rising, back when, you may recall, they had no culture. It is easy to mock Karen Brady, and it's also just the morally right thing to do, so really a win-win on that front. She is a multi-millionaire life peer who voted to take away tax credits from some of Britain's poorest workers and children. But it is likely that, without the move to the London Stadium, West Ham's revenue would be significantly lower now, their transfer expenditure would be a lot less in recent years, and they may well have been relegated over the last decade, instead of enjoying a handful of top-half finishes and, most notably, winning a European trophy on a famous night in Prague in 2023. What I am trying to say is that this issue isn't black and white. Unlike, of course, the Conservative Party fundraisers that Karen Brady attends. Ultimately, however, it goes back to where we started. No, not with the Big Bang, but with the best way that I have seen the move to the London Stadium described by West Ham fans, and that is the contrast between feeling like a fan and, more than that, a part of the club at Upton Park, actively involved in the action unfolding in front of you, and feeling like a customer at the London Stadium, far removed, both physically and spiritually, from the team, and there to serve the purpose of increasing West Ham's revenue and pushing them further up the all-important Deloitte Money League. The London Stadium is an asset owned by the public, paid for by the public, and managed by the public. Yet its only true purpose, post-2012, has been to increase the value of an asset owned by the super-rich, who were handed it by their pals for peanuts. While West Ham's attendances are incredible, and I do mean genuinely incredible given their relative lack of historic success and current league position, there has been a tremendous amount of churn among their supporters since the club moved to the London Stadium. Since 2016, and as of 2023, 28,930 West Ham fans haven't renewed their season tickets at the London Stadium. Of course, some of those will have died, unfortunately, or had changing life circumstances, but that is over half of all season ticket holders. Many lifelong West Ham fans, it seems safe to assume, have become alienated and left the club behind, feeling as though it no longer means what it once did to them. They have been replaced by new fans, so there has been no harm done to West Ham's owners or bottom line, but right now West Ham are struggling in the league, discontent lingers in the air at the London Stadium, and it is unclear how sticky West Ham's newer supporters will be once the going gets tough. If West Ham were to turn their form around, consistently played games with the same excitement and enjoyment as their European run a couple of seasons ago, and enjoyed success anything like Man City have at the Etihad, I've no doubt that the protests surrounding the stadium move would dissipate, temporarily at least. But the London Stadium will never be a football stadium in the truest sense of the term. It will always be a botch job. An eye-wateringly expensive botch job for the public, a highly profitable botch job for West Ham, and maybe even a tolerable botch job as far as future West Ham supporters will be concerned, but a botch job all the same. The fundamental issues with the London Stadium, 13 years and £1/3 billion later, remain insurmountable. It remains a monument not to any grand Olympic legacy or ideals, but to panic and desperation, a lack of foresight, and competing political ambitions. The only thing worse than it, arguably, is Finnish cuisine. Not my words, ladies and gentlemen, but the words of the late Jacques Chirac. Personally, I love a bit of rice, potato, and carrot in a pie. Anyway, that is it for today's video. Thank you all very much, as ever, for watching. There was loads more that I wanted to get into in this, including the wider gentrification of East London, but as you can tell, it was already quite long, so I guess I'll just have to shoehorn that into another video in the future. Hit the like button if you enjoyed today's video. I obviously hope that was the case. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and of course it goes without saying, make sure that you are subscribed and have notifications turned on not just for this channel, HITC Sevens, but also my second channel, Alfie Potts Armor, both of which should be about to appear on your screens now, along with a couple of videos that you might enjoy watching after this one. You can also find me on various social media platforms should you, for some reason, wish to do that, all of which should be available, along with everything else that I just mentioned, via the video description below. Cheers, and have a magnificent day.